Okay, so why do borders exist under capitalism? This, I think, is a complex issue. In order to address it, hopefully effectively, we have to look at some of the major contradictions associated with the market, the state, and with nations and nationalism. Now, this isn't an area that's been given much attention by our tradition of revolutionary Marxism. The views I'm putting forward are really my own and perhaps a subject for further discussion. But as the border question is so pressing now, I hope we'll have much more discussion in order to get to the heart of some of the problems. Now, in the 1990s, theorists of globalization began to argue that economic change, neoliberalism, was going to produce what they called a borderless world. And a number of academics and management strategists and so on, who have since become rather notorious for this, argued that capital, goods and people would soon move across the planet without hindrance, without the obstacles of state borders. In fact, of course, the movement of people, in particular, is the subject that continued to be the subject of huge interest from states. And arguably, control of migration is a greater concern now than at any time since the 1920s. Migration control, and that means, of course, borders, produces massive human tragedies and huge injustices. I don't have to make the case for that in 2011. And we can't understand these tragedies and injustices, I think, can't understand them fully without addressing some of the most important contradictions in capitalist development. And I'm going to address three issues. First of all, the nature of the state and its relationship to nationalism. Secondly, the demands of the market and the agenda of control through borders. And finally, I want to look quickly at internationalism and the politics of solidarity with migrants. So first of all, the question of the state and nationalism. And the question immediately arises, of course, what is the state? And famously, Engels argued that at the heart of the state are what he called institutions of coercion, means of, if necessary, of applying violence to the population in the interests of the exploiting class. So, the state requires, or the modern state requires, police, prisons, a judiciary, i.e. people who send people to prison, the military, bodies of armed men, as Marx and Engels put it, to enforce class rule. But, it's a very important but, or a very important additional factor, states of the modern era also require something else. Because since the emergence of industrial capitalism and the importance of free labour, in other words, the coming into being of an industrial working class, industrial proletariat, labour that is not tied to the land, an old feudal type relation. So since the coming into existence of a modern working class, those in power in the state have attempted to establish consent to their rule. So as well as means of violence, the modern state has wanted to induce consent, i.e. consent to us, put it at a slightly more abstract level, to acquiesce in our own exploitation. Now, one means of achieving this has been through nationalism. So since the early modern era, I'm going to refer to a bit of potted history now. Since the early modern era, roughly since the 17th century, the state has developed not just as a state in the abstract, but as a nation state. Now, the nationalism of the modern era, roughly the last 400 years, as Benedict Anderson, a sociologist who died recently, famously argued, that the nationalism of the modern era implied attachment to what he called an imagined community. Some of you will be familiar with this phrase. The idea that a mass of people who would never meet, never interact directly, but a mass of people who would be induced to believe that it's possible to share interests as compatriots, in other words, as members of a national collective, including the idea that this imagined community, this mass of people part of a nation, could subordinate themselves to a national authority. Maybe that would be a monarch, a president, a parliament, a system of national laws. And to the idea of a common identity focused around certain symbols of allegiance. The national flag, the mother, quotes, or father of the nation. You think Britannia or Joan of Arc in the case of France. And these ideas bolstered by myths of national origin, where the nation came from. Invariably, nations are thought to have ancient historic origins. They by and large don't, of course. Bolstered by myths of national origin and stories about national achievement, and usually ideas about national superiority in relation to other nations. Now, what differentiated these arrangements from those of the pre-capitalist era, up until, say, roughly 400 years ago? And this is important. Of course, states of different kinds have existed for millennia. There have been states for millennia, and you can't, think back, we've got somebody on Egypt here, so we think back to the ancient pharaonic empires of Egypt. You go to Cairo, you see the pyramids. They were constructed under imperial systems by rulers with enormous power, without the power of the state. So there have always been states of different sorts. But the state of the modern era has been a state in which those in power have made certain sort of territorial claims to authority over certain sorts of territory, and they've linked those claims to national identities. So, the modern nation-state emerged as a political unit with very carefully defined borders, within which the population, for the first time, and if we have a chance to discuss a bit more history, we can do, but for the first time in the so-called early modern era, think roughly the period, say, the English Revolution in the 17th century. Now, in states like the emerging English state of that period, which became the British state, the population was said to share certain specific characteristics which made them English, as opposed to the characteristics of peoples in other states which were emerging nearby in Europe, as opposed to being French or being Dutch, and so on. And here, borders were very important. They had unprecedented importance, because the rising bourgeois classes of this period, the emerging capitalist classes, wanted means to implement their new rules of the capitalist game. Systems of law, new systems of law, especially law relating to property, to private property, because there's great waves of privatisation taking place at this period. They wanted regulations for commerce, and of course, also, critically, means of controlling populations that were more volatile and resistant to authority than ever before. Because enormous numbers of people, of course, have been moved off the land into expanding new cities. People are moving off the land to become proletarians, to become industrial workers under new, highly exploitative conditions. You have very volatile populations and extremely high levels of resistance. So the rising capitalist classes, as well as wanting laws to sort out property disputes between them and so on, they want legal means and means of enforcement vis-à-vis large numbers of people who resist in large collectives such as the workforces of mines, of factories, and so on. So, what emerges through this period are ideas about belonging to the nation, a collective in which all these disparate groups of people, with all sorts of underlying agendas of their own, are induced to believe that they have something in common and that they should be prepared to subordinate themselves to new forms of authority in their state, the state to which they're alleged to belong, the idea of the state intimately connected to the nation. So you have both ideas about belonging to the nation and state bodies focused on regulation, on surveillance of the population, and on control. Now this produced a whole range of attempts to enforce central control, to enforce central authority on the population as if they're all members of this thing called the nation. So, for example, in 17th century France, there are mass expulsions of people who are deemed to be, who are said by those in authority to be inadequately French, not French enough to remain in the new nation. So the people who are kicked out in this period, in their hundreds of thousands, are the religious dissenters, the Calvinists, the people who became known as the Huguenots, who the Huguenots widely seen as the people who defined the first refugees in Europe. They're expelled in their hundreds of thousands because authentic French people were said to be exclusively Catholic. So the more you get nation states, the more you get certain agendas which are said to define the characteristics of those people who are going to be of the state and in the state, and those who are not entitled to be in the state and must be removed from the state. There are lots of examples of this, but the example of the Huguenots is a very, very good one. Now this was quite a long process, of course. The more coherent the state became, and the more authority that those in control of the state enjoyed, the more aggressively they pursued the idea of national belonging. So that 100 years after the expulsion of the Huguenots, after the French Revolution of the late 18th century, which was ostensibly, of course, pursuing liberty, equality, fraternity, and so on, linguistic conformity is imposed on the French population. Not enough that everyone has to be a Catholic. Well, things changed a bit in the Revolution, you have to say, as far as that goes. But now it's linguistic conformity. So in Republican France, being authentically French meant speaking a particular dialect of French. And those who are speaking German or Breton or the Languedoc of the southwest are said to be inferior and under suspicion, and the central government takes all sorts of measures against them. And this type of process sweeps across Europe, in particular in the 19th century, as the old empires of Europe, the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, later on the Ottoman Empire, as they break up, and in the place of these two or three big empires appear scores of states, which simply hadn't been there before, in which people authority are inducing very large numbers of their new compatriots to share the idea that these are historic states, they're rooted, in antiquity, and generating new myths of origin. And these states, each of them focusing not only on new territorial borders, physical borders, but on internal borders. And what I mean by internal borders are the ideas that some people are entitled to be citizens of these states and others are not. So most states that are shaped in this period, as part of the process of shaping of the state, it's not only that we of this state are different from those on the other side of the border, but there's very often an internal enemy as well. As if to remind you of how authentically British or Dutch or later on German or Italian you might be, there's an internal enemy as well. And those internal enemies of various sorts, usually ethnic minorities of this or that character, but increasingly in the 19th century, a generalised internal enemy, a Semitic enemy, a Jewish enemy. very, very common in the process of nationalisation of Europe in the 19th century. And just by this as a note, this type of approach exported by the European colonial powers to their empires. So the colonial states, which are created all over the world, where there have never been any nation states before, in the 19th and into 20th century, sort of mimic, in a way, the European states. Now, huge efforts went into convincing the mass of the populations of Europe that they were indeed French or British, or, as they say later, German or Italian, and so on. Now, these efforts, this area of history, has been very little researched until recently. Mainly, I think, because the subject itself, inventing nations, subverts the dominant agenda in professional history. You're a historian, Graham, aren't you? I hope you agree with this. Subverts the dominant agendas in professional history, because after all, historians are the most important storytellers, and they've been the ideologues of nation. They've written the official stories about who we're supposed to be, divided up into our various nations. But over the last 20 years or so, especially in European history, there have been some new approaches. If we think of Britain, for example, there's a fascinating book that some of you may have read by the historian Linda Colley, called Britons. It's well worth the read. It's a very accessible book. And it's an account of how the ruling class in 18th century Britain worked tirelessly to convince the mass of the population that they had allegiances to the British monarchy, the British Parliament, and the Union flag. And that above all, they were British as opposed to French or Dutch, because, as I said earlier, national identity was always defined as against others, people who had to be set apart by a type of politics of difference, and of course, by strong borders. Now that brings me to the second area I want to look at quickly, and that's the question of the demands of the market and the agenda of control. Because there was a problem for the rising capitalist classes, who by the period I'm describing are dominant all over Europe. There's a problem with the nation state as what I've described as a type of socio-cultural political construction. Because there was no necessary fit between the agenda of the nation state, the idea of the nation, the people authority in the nation, and the drive for profit, the market, which impelled the rising capitalist classes. So, members of the capitalist class needed the nation state, but they were not always in agreement about how to use nationalism and how to implement borders as part of the politics of control. And you can see this expressed in numerous nation states. But in the case of Britain, for example, it surfaced in huge debates, especially in the first decades of the 19th century, about free trade and protectionism. For those of us who've been through the British education system, all the debates about the Corn Laws and so on. But also in fierce arguments about whether to admit foreigners freely into Britain. So in the mid-19th century, some politicians backed unrestricted immigration of refugees from Europe. Others asked why subversives like Karl Marx, who lived for many years in London, and famously Karl Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, no, was it Capital it must have been, he wrote the Capital rather, in the reading room of the British Library. So he lived here for decades. So other politicians, senior politicians in Britain, said why are subversives such as Marx being allowed in? Now, you know, these are suspect foreigners, not only suspect foreigners, but dangerous revolutionaries. And if we have time, later we can discuss why London became home to thousands of European revolutionaries. But you see the way in which these arguments surfaced. Some factions of the ruling class were continuously hostile to immigration and the presence of migrants. So you look at the anti-Irish racism, in England in particular, in the 18th and 19th centuries. Vicious, violent, anti-Irish racism. But Irish people continued to arrive in very large numbers because, as cheap and vulnerable labour, they were critical to the expansion of British capitalism. So both arguments are going on. We don't like certain sorts of people because they're not authentically like us, and they don't have a stake in our nation. And that agenda stimulates all sorts of forms of petty racism. At the same time, large numbers of people continue to arrive because the market demands them. So there are two things going on simultaneously. So these contradictory views, expressed time and again over the years with various factions of the ruling class, want close control over the borders and people crossing them. Others are against it, largely because of that insatiable desire for cheap labour. But by the early 20th century, the politics of exclusion, of really focusing on the border, has become dominant. It's then, in the first decades of the 20th century, that the politics of exclusion and the border become dominant, and then it's at this time that passports come into general use. I mean, you might be familiar with this area of history, but lots of folks, understandably, think that, well, passports have been around for a few hundred years, and people always had passports. No! Passports were hardly in use until the First World War. And very interesting, actually, one of the reasons that passports were introduced by European states at the beginning of the First World War was not to stop people coming in, but mainly to stop young men getting out. Because with conscription in mind, the border's used, and this is another function of the border's not used not just to keep out, quotes, aliens, but to keep in nationals, because they had a role to perform. A role to perform which took them in the direction of the great patriotic sacrifice to die for your country, which is one of the logical outcomes of the national agenda. So passports come into general use. After the First World War, laws that restrict the movement of so-called aliens, this horrible term in English, aliens, you know, with all its associations of people from distant planets and so on. These laws enacted in this period, and eventually after the First War, in the 1920s, international migration all but comes to an end. The level of international migration in the 19th century and early 20th century is stunning. Millions of people move, especially across the Atlantic, the great Atlantic migrations, which boosted the population of the US when American capitalism was demanding huge volumes of labour. If you look at a graph of migration from Western Europe and Eastern Europe to the US, it rises like that through the 19th century up until the First World War, and it drops very, very rapidly. For almost 30 years, from the 1920s, border control, as part of what was then called the era of autarky, locks people into their, I put it in big quotes, own national territories. But after the Second World War, international migration resumes. There's a world boom. We call it a long boom, which lasted for some 20, 25 years. And then borders, which had earlier been thought of as sacrosanct, are largely ignored. Because it's convenient to the ruling classes. I'm talking mainly about Europe, because we have to somehow contain this discussion. That borders, which are being regarded as sacrosanct, become an obstacle to pursuing certain market-driven agendas. And in Northern Europe, states compete very aggressively with one another to recruit migrants from Southern Europe and from the global South. And millions of people move unhindered, without passports, without documentation. It's a period of world economic growth, and the border is viewed by most ruling classes as a hindrance. So I take the example of France in the 1960s. Millions of people without passports or any form of documentation are encouraged to enter France because there's a huge labour shortage in the wake of the Second World War. Even if they violate all sorts of formal border controls. In 1966, the French Minister of Social Affairs said, I quote him, clandestine immigration, in other words irregular or quotes illegal migration, is not without benefit For if we stuck to a strict interpretation of the rules and international agreements, we would perhaps be short of labour. But then in the 1970s, the post-war boom comes to an end, and borders are back in a very big way. States attempt to turn off the, quotes, I don't like the term, but flow of migrants. And they couldn't. They couldn't do it. France, Britain, Germany and so on, the big labour importing states, tried to stop the flow, they can't. For two reasons. First of all, once you establish what migration studies people call migration pathways, once you establish them, because they involve human beings with agendas of their own, you can't just stop them. People develop all sorts of purposes of movement, they develop all sorts of relations at each end of a migratory route, and they continue to bring people who've got compelling reasons to leave. Second, of course, the same economic crisis that was changing the policy over borders in Europe, because of recession in Europe, affected the global south, what was then called the Third World. And over the next 20 years, from the mid-1970s, many, many vulnerable regions of Africa and Asia and the Middle East experience economic collapse, civil conflict, war that compels millions of people to leave, and many, of course, head for the relative security of Europe. And now the politics of the border have again become very attractive to European states. The type of discourse we hear today about migrant threat really gets underway in the late 70s, early 80s, when migrants again say a threat, a menace to the good health of the nation, people who are different, destabilising to good order in society, people who should be excluded. And most important, in the context of domestic unrest in Europe, and I mean, we could be having this discussion about the Americas, for example, but because we limited restrictions on time and so on, I'm just going to keep it to Europe and our immediate experiences, if you like. In the context of domestic unrest in Europe, with hostility to governments, with rising levels of class struggle and general aspirations for change, migrants become a means of displacing responsibility away from those with wealth and power, with people with authority in the state. And today, of course, the border is again a site, a physical site, and the physical site of the border is very important. And I don't know how many of you will have noticed this, but it's only within the last 5 years or so that if you came into Heathrow Airport or Gatwick or Stansted or wherever it is, you encounter this sign saying UK border. Now, there never used to be such a sign. And now you have to walk under this thing saying UK border. And there's this notice warning you of all sorts of terrible consequences. You don't have certain sorts of papers and you don't present them in certain sorts of ways and so on. So the actual physical side of the border is very, very important. Not, I think, to make an impact on migrants of various origins, to make an impact on the domestic population. It's all part of this ideological agenda. We used to have, I can't remember what it was called now, it was all part of the Home Office that dealt with migration. We now have something called the Border Agency. And there are these horrible documentary programs on television about these immigration officers who are catching these people who are trying to sneak in various ways. So it's all part of a domestic, it's a part of an ideological agenda, part of the ideology of nation at a particular point in time, in which the state seems to assert its authority, in this case by saying we can control these borders, we can look after your security, we can take care of our citizens. You consent to our authority to do so, because of course consenting to that authority means you're consenting to a whole system of laws and built around the state itself. So borders have again become critical to state efforts to assert authority in the concept of the nation, of national belonging, and the exclusion of people who are said not to be of the nation. But this isn't part of a coherent, rational strategy. And I want to emphasise this point very strongly. If we seek rationality in the politics and history of migration, we won't find it. What we'll find is contradiction at every point. Most migrants to Western and Northern Europe, just like, say, most migrants to the USA from Central America, from countries like Mexico, continue to arrive despite the controls, even if they travel by clandestine means, taking huge risks for their lives. Mass deportation of irregular migrants, I put in big quotes again, illegal migrants, is very rare. Mass deportation is very rare. Deportations do sometimes happen. They're very ugly and violent. But we don't actually see very large numbers of police sweeping through the streets, arresting and deporting people. Not until now, anyway, in most European countries. They're rare because irregular migrants, clandestine migrants, are valued in European society. Valued as highly vulnerable and easily exploitable labour. And the more emphatic the ideology of exclusion, the more vulnerable the migrants are and the more easily exploitable they are. And I don't have time for this now, but just as in other countries, in Europe, North America and elsewhere, key sectors of British capitalism have come to rely upon these very vulnerable migrants. So this is a contradiction that most media people and many academics still have difficulty understanding, or one they reject because of its subversive implications. Okay, last thing I want to deal with very quickly, and that's my third point about internationalism and the politics of solidarity. Now, the Communist Manifesto, of course, called on workers of all countries to unite. Marx and Engels didn't write extensively on the national question, still less the question of borders. But they were insistent on the need for internationalism as against the false notion of national loyalties. Internationalism has been presented in many forms, including recently in Europe by the idea, these are rather clumsy words in English, but of Europeanity or Europeanness. The notion that Europeans have certain characteristics in common which differentiate them from others, from non-Europeans. This has been part of the ideological agenda of the European Union, together with what one might call the symbols of banal, you might be familiar with the notion of banal nationalism. Here we have banal Europeanism, the European flag, the common currency, the European passport, and so on. But just as specific national identifications have produced at various times obsessions with the national border and exclusion, so the European superstate has its own exclusions. And since the world crisis of 2008 in particular, these have become more and more important to EU governments as a means of collectively demonstrating their individual authority and their authority as a European Union. The outcome, of course, is a long list of tragedies at sea and en routes into European states that have claimed tens of thousands of lives. So what individual states used to do with their borders, the European Union now organises in a much more wide scale and much more destructive way. The European Union has hardened the borders of member states. Now, like probably many people in this room, I personally had absolutely no difficulty in voting to leave the European Union. In particular, because of what I'd come to understand of the consequences of the migration policies of the EU. Rather than the EU being about smiley internationalism, if you look at the history of the way that different states have acceded to the EU, particularly smaller states, Denmark, Ireland, Greece and so on, as these states join, they're made to be more exclusive by the European Union, to change their laws on asylum rights, for example, so that the European Union has become a means of more effectively excluding people who have profoundly important reasons for seeking security in this part of the world. So the EU's hardened its borders. It shows how the border as an ideological device used by capitalist classes as part of efforts to displace their responsibility for economic failure and instability, what happens at the national level happens at the supranational level. Genuine internationalism challenges the border and all border controls. We welcome those said to be outsiders, we of the revolutionary Marxist tradition, understanding from history the contradictory and ultimately false idea of separation by nation and national identity. And of course we say that migrant lives matter and that refugees are welcome here. Thank you.
Excellent meeting as always, Phil. And I agree entirely in terms of the attitude of historians. There is a very good book by Eric Hobsbawm called The Rise of the Nation State, which is which again I would recommend to people if they want to know a bit of the background of this. But it's worth remembering that for a long part of human history, the idea of a border, a fixed area, was very sort of general. It wasn't, there were some ideas of borders, but they're very contestable areas. Throughout the Middle Ages, for example, the area between areas of control, and it's better not to think of, perhaps like England and Scotland, the area controlled by the English king, the area controlled by the Scottish king. The areas between these areas were often very debatable. There might be a river, maybe sometimes you'd have a symbolic border. Offa, of course, built his dyke to mark where his rule stopped and the Welsh rule started, but it wasn't a policed area, it wasn't an area under control. And often the people in charge of these areas were there because they could police or they could try and, keep in control of these areas. Their marcher lords was the term, the marches were the debatable border areas. The area between England and Scotland was known as the debatable land. There were various towns which would change hands, but the actual border itself was very much contested. Even when you get the rise of the nation state during the early modern period, rather than having defendable borders, it was a matter of identifying people and excluding them. So the Huguenots is a good example that Phil gave. I mean, the Spanish state famously excluded the Jews and the Muslims because they refused to conform to their Catholic idea. We had to identify them and push them out, rather than actually stop them coming in the first place. In 1561, the Elizabethan Privy Council enacted something to find out how many aliens there were in London, so they could see if they were dangerous Catholics who might be plotting against the Queen. The point is they didn't know how many there were or who they were, because they have no border control. If you're actually looking for a time when there is a proper policed border, one where there is some form of immigration control, you're talking about the end of the 19th century. You're talking about the period after 1873, when you get a period both of an economic slump, but also a series of racist agitations. 1882 sees the first Chinese Exclusion Act in America on the basis of the Yellow Peril. Later on, Bismarck excludes a whole load of Poles from Prussia because it's being Polonized. And then, of course, in the early 1900s, you get the Aliens Act introduced in Britain. And who are the aliens? Who are these foreigners? They're the Jews. And they're specifically excluded. And then you get immigration policy as a result of that racist agitation.
And then, can I have Tom next, please?
Hi, my name's Stuart and I'm a teacher. And I currently teach in Shropshire, but I'm from Liverpool originally. I just want to make a contribution and see if there's any kind of maybe caucus for the teachers and stuff that's happening, because the thing that worries me the most is about the British values agenda in education, which I'm sure many of you are aware. I can see a lot of nodding heads with disapproval, and rightly so. So we're required by Ofsted to teach British values, and God, I'm going to try and list them off, it's obviously bollocks, but it's the idea of democracy, individual liberty, the rule of law, and tolerance are uniquely British values. And obviously we've applied to them to any member of the Conservative Party or members of the Labour Party, they would deem as un-British. But it is a mandated thing, and we're being tried to force to put in our schemes of work, and it's a very insidious and horrible development. So my request or question is to the speaker, what is out there to counteract this as a very kind of concise document, what we as teachers can do to battle this. We obviously do it on an individual basis and try and subvert that and tackle it head on in our classrooms. but what we can do and how we can contribute to counteracting the British Values agenda.
My name's Tom, I'm from the Socialist Workers Party student office. Just on that, I haven't got any specific concrete proposals, but I understand that there are some members of the NUT in this room, so maybe afterwards we should meet up and talk about what's possible. Look, I don't know about other people, right, but the reason that I came to this meeting is because I want to understand why borders exist so that we can tear them down, to be completely honest with you. I mean, the question of borders, I think, has become sharply focused, really, for two reasons. Well, three reasons, but two of them are related. One of which is the refugee crisis, quite clearly, and the way in which fences and so on have been erected with the intention of literally crushing refugees against them. The other one, though, is the way in which refugees have refused to allow that process to go uncontested. The way in which we saw Syrian refugees breaking themselves through the Greek-Macedonian border in the face of riot police and so on has been absolutely inspirational, has been one of the things that has motivated me to think that we can fight against our rulers' response to the refugee crisis. And you know, I'm a member of the Socialist Workers Party. People may have seen the sign up there, refugees welcome, open the borders, and I think as a slogan, I think it's quite an important one really. Why? One, because, well, just from a very basic perspective, I think that we have to do something about the fact that people are dying in the Mediterranean and so on as a result of these racist policies. But then also because, I mean, there are 600,000 empty homes in Britain. That's a fact. There are 11 million empty homes across Europe, and I suppose the thing about raising the question of opening the borders is that actually it's a very dangerous prospect for our rulers. Why? Because if they do it, they have to admit two things. One, David Cameron, or whoever it happens to be, who's the Prime Minister in October, by the way, I think we can stop the Tories, but whatever. Whoever it happens to be would have to admit that Britain has destroyed the Middle East through war and imperialism over the past 100 years. And two, they would have to admit that there's something wrong with the way that resources are distributed in society. I think we should have a much more equitable distribution and so on. And I suppose I really want to finish by talking about the huge wave of solidarity that has emerged with refugees over the past, really since the picture of Aylan al-Kurdi and September the 12th when 100,000 people marched and so on. Because there's an incredible movement, 30% of British society have contributed, etc., etc. And the politics of that movement matter. I'm just finished on this, Rich. The politics of that movement matter. I think we have to take the question of refugee crisis and the question of the state as far as possible, and we have to look at ways that we can bring down these borders. Refugees are our friends in that process, but we have to raise political questions which don't just talk about the refugee crisis now, but talk about the nature of a society which excludes refugees in the first place, which leaves people to die, and so on. And in order to do that, we need revolutionary politics, and I suppose that's what we're trying to do as an organisation and why we're holding this event.
Hi, I'm Eleanor from Leeds, SWP branch. Sorry, can you guys hear me? Yeah. Okay. I wanted to say it was a really interesting meeting actually, because I wanted to come in to see how borders got put up so I can fucking tear them down. And, well, actually it was really clear also what you said about it's always what's convenient for the ruling class. That is what it's all about. And the borders are used by the state to control the people within that state and to make us scared of this other. And the fact that you were talking about they've always defined us against the other was really interesting, because you're right, the stuff that we hear about refugees these days, it's fucking familiar. Anyone who's looked at any bit of history, it is really familiar and really, really dangerous, which is why there's a lot of movement against this racism. But it's right that actually we do need to be looking at the broader question of states, of borders, because actually we do need to tear them down to solve this problem. That's why we always say open the borders, let them in, because they're dying there. And actually, whether that was happening or not, that would be our politics. The politics is clear on that. And I do remember reading a book about the British Empire, The Blood Never Dried. It's a very good book. but it's talking about the history of the British Empire, and I was just curious because it details many and various horrific things the British Empire did, but also how these borders were set up, and it was always for the ruling class. It would never cared a shit about workers, and you can still see the effects today. So, in conclusion, we should fight against this, we should fight against the racist bullshit which defines us against this supposed other, and tear down all the borders.
So just try interesting.
Hi, my name is Mani. I'm from the International Socialists in Ghana. Phil, thanks a lot. That was a wonderful presentation. I think that it reminds us very powerfully about the role of borders in generating austerity across the globe, generating war, generating racism. So, for example, we have a situation where the European Union, in terms of imposing its free trade agreements, its version of the TTIP, on its former colonial regions in Africa, Caribbean, and the Pacific, insist on this borderless world as long as it means the free movement of capital, as long as it means the free movement of business, people, and so on and so forth. Yet when it comes to the free movement of labor, it objects to it. It says that we must derogate and we must apply national laws. One ridiculous example of this is that it insists that people from Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific only can have free access to Europe under the terms of this trade agreement if they have a university degree and if they have particular work permits in particular areas. One commentator from Jamaica, for example, said that on that criteria, the people of Britain or elsewhere in Europe would never have seen live concerts by Lord Kitchener, Bob Marley, Peter Tosh, or whatever it is. Okay, and you can understand that this single instrument is also the basis of other gains, that it's not simply about racism in this case, but you can also see the value in terms of controlling copyright, and intellectual property production, and so on and so forth. On the other hand, you also hear the racist element of the Leave vote, talking in terms of allowing regions of the world where there's a long historical association with Britain, like the Commonwealth, to come instead of Eastern European migrants. Again, that's false. I remember that in 1986, it was the first time that the Thatcher government introduced visas in relation to Commonwealth countries. It did so by a selection of those where there was the biggest migrant inflows from those countries. India, Pakistan, Nigeria, and Ghana in one fell swoop. That is what it introduced in 1986. Today, in many instances, you find European authorities building the fortress Europe within those countries themselves. And they're able to do so because the use of migration means that they have also a direct influence on the structuring of the labor market in those countries. They have a direct influence on the meaning and value attached to human beings and the laboring classes in those countries as well. And of course, they have the imperial might to shape policy of those governments who are happy to collaborate for their own purposes. I don't know what politics, a specific analysis would have informed John Lennon when he wrote his famous song about Imagine. Imagine there's no country, nothing to kill or to die for. But listening to my brother from Sudan, I think that our imagination about the kind of world that we ought to see ought to allow us today, in the here and now, to step up our fight against war, against austerity, against racism, and bring closer that day that we all imagine about. Thank you very much.
Just to make sure we get as many people as possible, I'm going to restrict contributions now to 2 minutes. So I'm going to tap after 1 and then ask you to sum up after 2. Thanks. Something.
Hi, my name is Michael. I'm from London. Mine's just a question, not a contribution, so quite a quick one, hopefully. It's just basically, what was the initial agenda for border creation? You said quickly after the creation of borders, the ruling class sort of realised that there was little economic gain, and they acted as an obstacle. So I just asked, what was the initial agenda for the creation of the economy and economic? Which sort of brings me on to another question, which was, when they were created, was it as a result of racism? Today you could argue a lot of racism as a result of conditioning by these nation states, like you spoke about, this strive to alienate others. I'm not saying it's excusable, but that could be an argument. So at this point, when the nation states began, none of this condition was taking place. So what's the excuse for that racism? Why were they racist? Was it inherent? Why did they create these borders? Thank you.
Yeah. It's a response to the person before last who spoke, because I think Phil is absolutely right to locate the question of borders in a central contradiction of capitalism. Because on the one hand, capital always has a global orientation. It always aspires to be a global system to spread everywhere on the globe. On the other hand, capital tends to be organised, it clusters together, and it tends to cluster around particular nation states. And this contradiction leads to the emergence of nationalism, but it also leads to the emergence of borders to reinforce and strengthen nationalism. And one of the things that the capitalist class realised quite early in their history is the use that they can make of nationalism. You take Marx's early writings, he talks about the division in industrial cities of England between British and Irish workers. Nationalism here plays a key role in dividing the working class, but it's precisely a contradiction, because at the same time, capitalism promotes migration precisely through the uneven development of the capitalist system. And it's a very weird thing that the only places where you can find a debate calling for open borders, the only publications, are Socialist Worker and The Economist magazine. Because you get a right-wing version of the argument that sometimes appears in the Financial Times and The Economist, saying actually we're for open borders because what we want is a completely free market on a global scale, and therefore we want the free movement of labour to fulfil the needs of capital. We have to be clear that we don't defend free movement in those terms. Our vision of the world isn't a world where people are driven from their homes by war, misery and so on. Our vision of the world is a world free from nationalism and the petty chauvinism that divides workers, and a world in which working class people can unite across racial and national lines. But a central part of that argument is against borders. And I want to just finish by making a point about the way nationalism takes hold. You see, the left-wing social democratic argument for border controls is never posed in terms of directly in terms of chauvinism. The argument that always comes from Labour politicians is we need stronger borders, because if we don't have stronger borders, there'll be this outpouring of racism. Our argument at Socialism is completely different to that. Our argument is when people work, live, toil alongside each other, they can find bonds of solidarity that draw them together. That's why we in the Socialist Workers Party are proud to say that we're against all immigration controls, against the borders.
I have an apologies, mate. Roger will be the last speaker, so sorry to those who put their hands up. Yes, I did have your hand up. I did note you, but I'm afraid we're running out of time. So there are quite a few people that put their hands up, but we're out of time. So Roddy will be the last speaker, and he's got about a minute.
Oh goodness. Okay. I just really wanted to say that nationalism and borders are part of the common sense of capitalism. And the reason I say that is because if you think about something that's very often said but makes absolutely no sense, think about, I'm proud of my country, and I'm proud to be British or Scottish or whatever it is. What did I do to achieve that? Absolutely nothing. So it makes no sense whatsoever from the perspective of our class. The working class knows no borders because we cannot rule, we cannot change society without disposing of those borders. The ruling class need borders because they have to regulate exploitation, and therefore they have to compete with the warring brothers, other capitalists, and they are mainly brothers, of other countries in order to better exploit their own workforce and use that as a stick to beat their own workforce with. So the most common argument we've had over the course of the last few months, in particular since the refugee crisis began, we can't let them in, we don't have room, what about our jobs, what about our houses? Of course the we is not controlled by we at all, it's controlled by them, the ruling class. And that's a contradiction about borders and nationalism, and that's why, for example, the British passport will get you into, the British and American passports get you into the most countries in the world, the Eritrean, Afghan and Palestinian passport get you into the least countries in the world, because there's nothing egalitarian about this process. It's all about imperialism, and it's all about the competition between national states and national capitals to carve up the world more effectively between them. And that's why we must, in principle, be opposed to them, and as socialists be proud of the denial of our nationality.
First on the question of the British values agenda, very, very important question which of course embraces the issue of prevent and the like. The question of British values is a very interesting one historically in relation to migrants and borders. By the 19th century, the ideology of the British state was well established, and British politicians, the historians, others who advanced the national story, had a very specific story to tell. They talked a lot about something called British liberty. And if you remember, I mentioned the question of why were so many European revolutionaries admitted to Europe, to Britain. Because the astonishing thing is that in the whole of the 19th century, not one refugee from Europe who attempted to enter Britain was refused entry. Not one. And that included people who stood in the tradition that became communism. It included anarchists, it included people from radical nationalist movements in Italy and Poland and what became Germany and so on. And there's very interesting analysis of this by a historian by the name of, I hope I've got the right Porter, Peter Porter. And he looked at what he called the refugee question in mid-Victorian Britain. Why, or in what form was the argument for the admission of all these people presented by British politicians? And examining all the archives and so on, he came to the following conclusion. He said, if the people, this is the British people, were persuaded that they were free, there was less likelihood that dissent would go to proportions that would require the trouble and expense of overt repression. Toleration of foreign refugees bolstered this mechanism by highlighting the openness, freedom and stability of Britain's society by direct and stark contrast with their European neighbours. In other words, British politicians said, we welcome our enemy's enemy. The people who are trying to change European societies, European states. For example, the people who have been involved in the great 1848 revolutions tried to come to Britain. The British government says, come on in. Welcome to British liberty, to British freedoms. And they used the presence of the refugees to burnish the reputation of the British political system and of themselves. So at different times, the values agenda is used for different purposes. It can be used as part of a relatively open approach to certain sorts of migrants. It can be used to close down migration in different circumstances. Okay, second point. I was asked about the initial agenda for the creation of borders. Well, this is a very complex question, and it's very little research. There's very little work done. And Graham pointed out that until the coming of the modern state, border areas were almost everywhere very, very blurred. And we wasn't talking then about the borders between nation states. I mean, we've all grown up with maps and atlases and the like, which show the world divided up into these neat nation states with all these blobs, all these colours on. I mean, looking around the room, there probably aren't many people of my vintage in the room. But when I was at school in the 1950s, they used to show us these maps, and there was a globe in the classroom, and the teachers would point and say, look at all the pink bits, they're ours, you know. But most of them, of course, were colonial states, and we've got used to seeing the world divided up by these neat borders. The borders between the great empires were incredibly blurred, and there was no necessary reason in big imperial blocks, many of which were quite cosmopolitan in nature. In other words, people of all sorts of different linguistic group, religious affiliations, and the like, accommodated one another. I don't want to romanticise it, put it higher than that. They lived under circumstances of accommodation. It's a brilliant book I'd recommend to anyone interested in this. Thank you. It's about so-called cosmopolitanism, the accommodation of people with different cultural characteristics in the Ottoman Empire. It's a book about the city of Salonika. It's called Salonika, City of Ghosts, by Michael, help me, his name will come to me, never mind. Salonika, City of Ghosts. It tells you how for 500 years, at certain periods, the Muslims would dominate. At certain periods, and for decades, the Jews were dominant in the commercial and political life of the city. At certain times it was the Orthodox Christians. They didn't go to war over it, and there weren't national agendas over it. So when the borders were specified, what was the process? Well, the process varied from place to place. But the important thing is that in the most advanced capitalist countries of Northern Europe, and in, say, the 17th century, you're talking about the Netherlands, Holland, you're talking about England, which then becomes Britain. In these sorts, and then later on France, in these sorts of societies, they developed a greater and greater interest in the border. And what's that driven by? That's driven by this dual agenda that I referred to earlier. On the one hand, the rising capitalist class wants to see uniform laws. So that, for example, capitalists themselves, who are in dispute over commercial deals and so on, can have confidence in a legal system which will resolve the issue on the basis of a common agenda in relation to private property and so on. So where you have the border drawn, the more you can expand the borders of the nation state, the more you can impose laws and regulations which are of interest to the capitalist class and the emerging state within it. For example, you can tax people. You can impose customs regulations and so on. That's one dimension of it. The other dimension is that you can draw people into the political constituency of the state. Encourage them to think of themselves as having a national identity. And one thing that fascinated me more than anything else in Linda Collins' book, Britons, you know, the strange, as a kid I always remember wanting to do with the ancient Britons were, you know, who were these Britons? There were no bloody Britons. Anyway, this notion of the Britons was invented in the 18th century. And one of the key ways of doing it was through the military agenda, by mobilising people into regiments. And you know, did you ever ask yourself, why have all these British Army regiments got these funny names, like the Hertfordshire Fusiliers, or the Northumbrian, I don't know, you know, horse artillery or something, you know. And these regiments were mainly raised in the 17th century by the aristocracy and by local members of the rising capitalist class. And it was all part of the national agenda of defending Britain against outsiders. And in the late 19th century, those outsiders were the revolutionaries of France. It's fascinating reading, the huge efforts that go into the ideological construction of the border. Because the most important thing about the border is that though it can be an apparently physical space, the border is a relationship. And it's in our minds. It's a relationship between the people in authority and the people that they wish to subordinate. Just one very final quick point about this. At this time, the colonial venture is expanding. Colonialism is expanding. The European states are competing in what they then called the colonial world, what we would today call the global south. And the way in which they carve out their areas of authority, which eventually become colonial states, also has its impact on the way that the colonial state is constructed in Europe. So there's a relationship between these things. Joseph mentioned the impulse of capitalism, the global impulse of capitalism. And what the European powers did as part of the expansion of the market in the global south in their colonies, particularly in the context of slavery, has its impacts domestically in Europe as well. Very last comment is this, that at this particular moment, this particular time, a contributor to the discussion asked, you know, what do we do? What practical ways of contesting the border? There have never been more ways to contest the border than are presented to us now, by the issue of migrants in general, by the issues of refugees in particular. In acts of solidarity, we will do the best we can to clarify the issues and to demonstrate that indeed, you know, we, as many people have said, are hostile to borders and hostile to the divisions that separate us from our brothers and sisters in other countries. Thanks.